There is a very specific kind of pain that comes from thinking about someone who barely speaks, barely explains, barely reaches back, and yet somehow lives in your mind like a voice that never leaves. It's the pain of silence that feels louder than words. You replay the last message, the last look, the last moment they seemed close, and then suddenly far away, like someone stepping backward into fog, while you stand there trying to understand whether you imagined the warmth at all. You tell yourself you should be over it by now. You tell yourself it makes no sense that someone so emotionally unavailable could still take up this much space inside you. And yet they do. Because what hurts the most is not just losing them. It's not knowing what was real. It's not knowing whether they cared, whether they miss you, whether their silence means peace or war. And if an avoidant is constantly on your mind, if you feel them in the quiet moments, if your body still reacts to their absence like something unfinished, something unresolved, then you need to hear this with absolute clarity. Your obsession is not random. It was built. Not because you are weak, not because you are dramatic, and not because they were some magical, irreplaceable person. It happened because avoidant dynamics create one of the most psychologically addictive emotional loops a human nervous system can enter. Intermittent closeness, sudden withdrawal, brief warmth, cold distance. A hint of intimacy, followed by emotional disappearance. That pattern does not create peace. It creates pursuit. And the brutal truth is this. The more you chased clarity from someone who feared emotional exposure, the more you trained your own mind to treat them like a mystery that must be solved before you can feel safe again. That is why they stay on your mind. Not because the connection was complete, because it was incomplete. Your brain does not obsess over what feels settled. It obsesses over what feels interrupted. So while you've been asking, why can't I stop thinking about them? The deeper question is this. What is happening inside them while you are carrying this weight? Because as much as it may not look like it from the outside, avoidance is not the absence of feeling. It is the fear of feeling too much. That's the part most people never understand. They think avoidant people leave because they do not care. They detach because they're cold. They disappear because nothing touched them. But many avoidant people do not shut down because they feel nothing. They shut down because what they feel activates too much. Intimacy does not register as simple warmth to them. It often registers as pressure, demand, exposure, risk, a loss of internal control. When closeness deepens, their nervous system can interpret love the way another person might interpret danger. Not because love is dangerous, but because somewhere in their emotional wiring, dependence became associated with pain, engulfment, criticism, disappointment, or loss of self. So when they start caring, really caring, the amygdala can light up like an alarm system. The body shifts into protection. Cortisol rises. The nervous system says, back away before this gets bigger than you can manage. And instead of moving toward connection, they move toward distance. Not because the bond meant nothing, because it meant enough to scare them. That is why so many avoidant people can seem present one moment and unreachable the next. One day they're opening up, revealing pieces of themselves they don't show to many people. The next day, they are dry, vague, distracted, pulling their energy back like they regret being seen at all. To the person on the receiving end, it feels cruel, disorienting, almost unreal. But inside them, it often feels like drowning in something they cannot name. They do not always think, I need to hurt this person. More often, their system says, This is getting too intense. I need space. I need control. I need to shut this down before I disappear inside it. And that is where your suffering began. Because you interpreted their withdrawal the way most loving people do, as something to repair. So you leaned in. You explained more. You reassured more. You reached out more carefully, more gently, more urgently. You thought if you found the perfect tone, the perfect timing, the perfect amount of patience, you could bring them back into the emotional room with you. But every time you moved closer to close the gap, they felt the gap more intensely. And this is the brutal truth that changes everything. The behavior that makes sense to you in love can feel invasive to someone organized around emotional distance. Not because your love is wrong, because their defenses are old. Your consistency can feel like pressure to a person who survives by self-containment. Your need for clarity can feel like a threat to someone who keeps control by staying unreadable. Your emotional honesty can feel like exposure to someone who learned long ago that vulnerability costs too much. So no, they didn't stop caring. They got overwhelmed. And if you really let that sink in, you'll stop asking the wrong questions. You'll stop asking why they became cold, and start seeing that coldness was often their version of panic. Quiet panic. Controlled panic. Well-dressed panic. The kind that looks like indifference from the outside. Now here is the concept that changes the entire dynamic. Silence. Not punishment. Not game playing. Not fake detachment. Silence. Real silence. The kind that begins when you stop feeding the loop. Because when an avoidant is constantly on your mind, it is usually because part of you is still psychologically in conversation with them. Even when you don't text them, you're answering them internally. You're defending yourself in imaginary arguments. You're fantasizing about what you'd say if they came back. You're trying to decode their last breadcrumb. You're emotionally available to someone who is not physically present. That is not silence. That is internal pursuit. And avoidant dynamics feed on pursuit, because pursuit lets them stay in the powerful position of distance. As long as you are reaching, they do not have to confront the full emotional reality of your absence. They can feel you without choosing you. They can keep you in orbit without stepping into intimacy. They can tell themselves the connection still exists without having to face what their avoidance is costing them. But silence changes the chemistry. When you stop reaching, stop explaining, stop reacting, stop offering your nervous system as a bridge back to them, something subtle and profound begins to happen. The emotional structure flips. Because now the person who was always managing distance has to encounter distance. And that is when they begin to feel what your presence was regulating for them. At first, they may look unaffected. They may distract themselves, work more, scroll more, talk to other people, numb out, tell themselves it was for the best. This is where people get confused. They assume that because the avoidant is not visibly emotional, nothing is happening inside. But avoidant processing is delayed. What hits you immediately often hits them later. You feel the loss in the moment. They feel it in the echo. When the chase stops, when the reassurance stops, when your energy is no longer moving toward them like an invisible current, the dopamine pattern begins to shift. The person who once got small bursts of emotional certainty from your availability no longer receives them. The nervous system that was used to managing closeness from a safe distance can no longer measure your devotion in real time. And uncertainty, the very thing they once made you live in, begins to move toward them. Then the mind starts. They wonder if you're done. They wonder if you met someone else. They wonder why you're not reaching. They revisit moments they brushed past too quickly. The softness in your voice. The look on your face when you tried one last time. The message they never answered properly. The intimacy they cut off because it made them feel too exposed. They start feeling not just your absence, but their own behavior reflected back at them in a silence they cannot control. And that silence becomes a mirror. That is when many avoidant people begin thinking about you more than they expected to. Not always because they suddenly became secure, not always because they are ready, but because your absence forces contact with what their defenses were keeping at bay. The thing they avoided was not you. It was what you awakened. It was the tenderness, the dependency, the need. The possibility that someone could matter enough to destabilize the careful emotional architecture they built to survive. So yes, if an avoidant is constantly on your mind, there is a very real chance you are on theirs too. But not in the simple, romantic way people want to believe. Not as a fantasy scene where they instantly wake up, cry, and run back transformed. More like this. They feel a pull they do not know how to admit. A restlessness, a mental return. A strange discomfort in the spaces where your attention used to be. They feel your absence not just as loss, but as exposure. Because now there is no one softening the impact of their own distance. No one volunteering to understand them while being neglected. No one chasing them into emotional safety. And that unsettles them. Picture it. They're in bed at night, phone in hand, checking something meaningless, then pausing on your name longer than they want to admit. They tell themselves they're just curious, just passing through. But the body knows better. There's tension in the chest, a drop in the stomach, a flicker of memory. They remember a moment with you that felt too intimate, too real, too close. The exact moment they started pulling away. The exact moment your love started asking them, without words, to be fully present. And they couldn't. So they disappeared into logic, into independence, into emotional minimalism. But distance does not erase attachment. It only buries it under control. And buried attachment has a way of resurfacing in silence. That is why some avoidants come back with vague check-ins, random messages, casual energy, a meme, a reaction, a hey. Something small enough to preserve pride, but real enough to test whether the door is still open. They often do not return with a grand confession. They return with a pulse check. Because what they want, before vulnerability, is proof. Proof that you are still there. Proof that they still have access. Proof that the emotional bridge did not collapse while they were gone. And this is where everything can break again. Because when you have spent weeks or months aching for contact, that tiny return can feel like rain in a drought. Your whole body lights up, dopamine surges, hope rushes in. You think, finally, they missed me. They're ready. This means something. Maybe it does, but not enough. Not yet. Because if nothing has changed beneath the surface, the pattern will repeat, with new words and the same wound. They will come close, feel activated, get overwhelmed, retreat. And you will once again be left trying to metabolize a connection that never learned how to stay. That is why silence is not about making them miss you. It is about helping you hear yourself again. It is about creating enough distance from the loop that your nervous system can stop translating inconsistency as love. It is about becoming unavailable to confusion. It is about refusing to hand your self-worth to someone who only knows how to approach intimacy in fragments. And the moment you understand that, the power begins to move. Not because you become colder, because you become clearer. You stop romanticizing their inability to choose you fully. You stop calling emotional deprivation depth. You stop treating potential like commitment. You stop believing that your job is to love someone so well they finally stop being afraid. That was never your job. You were not put here to become a healing environment for someone who keeps turning your heart into a waiting room. Read that again in your bones. A waiting room. That is what this dynamic becomes when you stay too long. You sit there, rehearsing patience, calling it love. You monitor every signal, every delay, every half-open door. You shrink your needs so they won't feel pressured. You become hyper-attuned, over-giving, emotionally fluent for two people. And slowly, without realizing it, your life starts orbiting around someone else's inability to stay. That is not romance. That is self-abandonment with poetic lighting. And the deepest shift happens when you stop asking whether they are thinking about you and start asking whether you have been thinking too little about yourself. Because the truth is, your obsession with them may also be a form of escape. As long as you are studying them, decoding them, waiting on them, you do not have to fully face the grief of what this cost you. You do not have to face how often you betrayed your own intuition to preserve the bond. You do not have to sit with the pain of wanting someone who only knew how to love in controlled doses. But healing begins when the fantasy collapses. Not the fantasy that they cared. They may have. The fantasy that caring is enough. It isn't. Someone can miss you and still not choose you. Someone can feel deeply and still be dangerous to your peace. Someone can think about you constantly and still not be capable of giving you the kind of love your body can actually rest inside. That is the maturity most people resist because it hurts. But it also frees you. Because once you see it, really see it, you stop trying to win emotional consistency from emotionally inconsistent people. You stop performing worthiness in the hope that one day they will feel safe enough to stay. You stop measuring your value by how unforgettable you were to someone who could not hold intimacy without retreating from it. And then something extraordinary happens. You become harder to manipulate. Not because you build walls, but because you stop negotiating with neglect. Your energy changes. You no longer vibrate at the frequency of, "Please choose me." You begin to stand in the frequency of, "I choose myself." And that shift is felt by everyone, including them. Because the moment you truly detach, not performatively, not to provoke them, not as a strategy, but as a real act of self-return, you become unfamiliar to the pattern. You are no longer supplying the old dynamic, no longer chasing, no longer reassuring, no longer available on the terms of emotional scarcity. And scarcity loses power when you stop worshipping it. So if they are on your mind tonight, if their silence is scratching at old wounds, if part of you still wonders what is happening to them while they are away from you, here is the answer. They may be feeling the void they created. They may be missing the nervous system safety your presence gave them. They may be remembering you in the delayed language of avoidance. They may be restless, curious, conflicted, even haunted. But your life cannot be built around maybes. Your healing cannot depend on their realization. Your worth cannot wait for their return. Your power cannot begin the day they finally admit what you meant. It begins the moment you stop needing the admission. That is the real transformation. Not getting them back, getting yourself back. The version of you that does not beg for clarity from confusion. The version of you that does not confuse being deeply affected with being deeply loved. The version of you that can look at silence and no longer hear rejection, but instruction. Walk away from what starves you. Do not translate distance into destiny. Do not call emotional unavailability a special connection, just because it wounded you deeply. Some wounds feel profound only because they were reopened again and again. That is not depth. That is repetition. And you are allowed to end the repetition. You are allowed to become someone an avoidant can no longer access through ambiguity. Someone who does not collapse at the first breadcrumb. Someone who recognizes that longing is not always intuition. It is often chemistry mixed with grief. Let them think about you. Let them feel the silence. Let them face the space where your devotion used to live. But you become unreachable to the version of love that asked you to disappear in order to keep it. This is your identity shift. You are not the one left behind. You are not the one who was too much. You are not the one who needed to be less emotional, less honest, less alive to be chosen. You were simply standing in front of someone whose defenses were stronger than their capacity. That is not your shame to carry, so lift it off your chest. Let the mind quiet. Let the body come home. Let the story end where your self-abandonment ends. And if they return one day, let them return to someone different. Not the version of you still waiting in the dark. Not the version still starving for one clear sentence. Not the version willing to bleed just to be remembered. Let them return, if they return at all, to someone rooted, someone discerning, someone whole. Someone who finally understands that being unforgettable to the wrong person is not power. Being unavailable to what breaks you is. That is power. That is peace.